All right, welcome back. This is day 3. I'm your host, Zhia, and yesterday we were just talking about how I hacked my way around to finding a job in the industry. And even though, what am I putting this headphones on for? All right, before we start, let me crack open a drink and can you hear that? All right, so where was I? So yesterday was day 2 and we were talking about my experience, how I graduated from college without a job lined up, and I had never worked at any of the big tech companies and had to kind of work my way around. So I built this hack to apply for jobs automatically, and that eventually helped me land a couple of interviews and finally got a job at a startup. There was definitely, I think it was an interesting conversation for myself. I really enjoyed kind of reminiscing, talking about that experience, because I think as software engineers, being able to make something that scratches your own itch, solves your own problem, it's a very useful experience to have. And it doesn't hurt anyone. If you're trying to get more opportunities for yourself, and trying to solve one specific problem, at the end of it, what's the worst thing that could happen here? It could turn into a really interesting story for you to talk about with your friends, on YouTube if you want, or if you're a potential new employer. So highly recommend checking that out. And I have actually written an article about that where I just wrote everything in specific detail about how the script was built, what were the tools that I use, and kind of all of that good stuff. So I'll add a link to it in the description somewhere below here, or go to my website, zhiachang.com, and then I have all of those interesting blog sites, everything kind of down there. So go check that out. So that was day 2, and today this is day 3, and I wanted to talk about my experience going into the industry as a entry-level software engineer and what it was like, what I went through, what were the challenges and hurdles that I went through, and how I could use them about them as I progressively matured, right? So I think when I first got my job, this was in 2013. So it was, the tech industry was starting to boom and a lot of the big tech companies were coming up. You have Snapchat, you have Pinterest, basically all these social media companies, and a lot of tech companies were really growing really fast, and they had a lot of open positions. So what that means for new grads coming into the industry is that you're seeing a lot of new opportunities there, a lot of job openings. And of course, I think the competition at the time was pretty rough too, because a lot of people wanted to get into these high demand, big tech, FAANG companies, because that's where all the money's at. That's where all the benefits were. You could work from home, you have your lunches, breakfast, dinners, and all that kind of put in there. So competition definitely was pretty rough. For me, heading into the industry as a new grad, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to be a software engineer for the long run, right? There was something that I really struggled with, which was, do I see myself being a software engineer first, or do I see that as potentially a stepping stone for a different career? Maybe as a product manager, as an engineering manager, or maybe as a data scientist. For me, I think software engineer was the easiest way to get into the field because, one, skills are very much required. If you become a software engineer, you acquire skills that are useful regardless of what direction you want to head towards in the future. Even if you want to be a project manager or product manager, or you want to be a data scientist, or you want to be an engineering manager, or you want to create your own startup in the future, right? Having the ability to understand technology, to build things using your own hands. I think for me, number one, that was a important realization for myself. So I figured I gotta know all these things anyway. So it doesn't matter if I want to go into management in the future, but I probably still need to figure out how to write code, how to ship things, how to build things. So that was number one. And then number two, in terms of what direction I wanted to head towards, I felt software engineering was a really good opportunity, at least for the first few years, for me to get my hands dirty, to know how products are actually built and what are the processes that goes into building an actual product. How do you work with product managers? How do you work with testers? How do you work with designers, right? So there were a lot of things that you need in order to build a real product. And the best way to get a closer insight to that is you're actually on the ground building things. And for me, that was something that I picked up pretty early on, that regardless of what direction I headed towards, I wanted to have that hands-on experience, working closer to on the ground, building the product, understanding the space, understanding how do you build a high quality, scalable product. So I think those two things guided my career decision at the time. That plus, I think the other thing too was I was on a visa and I was an international student, so I didn't have a lot of options at that point. I wanted to stay in the country, I wanted to get my green card, and it would be very difficult for me if I decided not to pursue a career as a computer science or a software engineer. For example, if I wanted to be a real estate agent, to get a green card through that career path, it's going to be very different. So that has just helped me trim out all of the other options pretty quickly. And software engineering, because if I remember there's an article that I saw at that time where it was talking about demand for software engineers in the US and in the world was all-time high, but the supply of good software engineers was all-time low. So a lot of schools, they weren't producing enough computer science grads. So companies were struggling to hire. They weren't hiring fast enough. So there was this big demand for good software engineers, but not enough people to fill it in. So combining all of these different data points helped convince me that being a software engineer was the right path to take. That was more of like the macroeconomic side of it. And then internally, for my personal motivation, I really like building things. As you can probably see, right, from how I built this script to hack my job application, I derive a certain sense of fun, pleasure, satisfaction from being able to build things to solve my own problems. And it's a skill that I think, regardless of where you go, it's going to be applicable anyway. And one thing I really like doing is just going online and trying to hack things around and see. I say hack in a very loose sense. It doesn't mean I'm trying to break into a website. I'm just trying to see what are loopholes in the website that I can maybe play around with. Maybe there's a text that's hidden in there. Google is probably well known for doing this, especially when there's Easter egg days or stuff like that. So I really like doing those things. And so from my personal interest perspective, I knew that being a software engineer was a really interesting career, and there's so many different things I could head towards in the future. There's fintech, there was search, there was ads, ML or AI wasn't as big of a thing in 2013, or maybe I wasn't exposed to it. So to me, it didn't really feel like it was as big of a thing. Autonomous driving wasn't as big of a thing back then as well. But sure, there were a lot of different fields. So if you were a software engineer and technically you're very strong, you had all these opportunities to branch out into different fields. So I felt like there were a lot of upsides to it, not a lot of downsides. I was very interested, very passionate about computer science, about technology in general. So everything just lined up really well for me. So when I headed into the industry for the first few years, I was working at a startup, and I was very fortunate because the people around me were either people who had worked at Microsoft, at LinkedIn, at Amazon. And being in Seattle, it's very easy to find people of high caliber, high talent like that. And because you have this mass of talent concentrated in one city, and I think you can say the same thing about San Francisco or Menlo Park, right? You have this mass of really good talent all concentrated in one place. So you get to learn really fast. It's basically like a download, right? You're just downloading everyone's experience, their expertise, and you just pick up all of the skills and traits that comes with that. So I thought that was really, really interesting for me. That first few years, I just learned really fast. A lot of things were not covered in the industry. For example, you would use GitHub in college for small projects, but you probably never run into a lot of merge conflicts, probably never run into being able to work with people overseas who are testing your stuff. How do you write test cases for people who are overseas and making sure that you can collaborate with them to test your software in a very holistic way? All of these things, you probably don't get a lot of those opportunities in college. So I was very fortunate to be in that position where I could work with highly talented engineers who really knew their craft really well, and they taught me a lot of best practices, like how do you write code, how do you review code, how do you resolve conflicts, both from a technical perspective of resolving conflicts when there's code collisions, and how do you resolve conflict with people when there are collisions in terms of ideas, in terms of proposals, and how do you make sure that we're building the best product for the consumer. So I don't think I have a lot of regrets from those few years, because I really absorbed everything like a sponge. They taught me a lot of things, and I worked a lot of hours in those first few years because I was not the smartest. I was not the one with the most shiny resume, but I was probably, I had a strong belief that I could outwork almost anyone. I have very strong discipline, very strong work ethics. And I think this primarily also comes from my background being a student athlete. So I don't mind putting in the hours. I don't mind working harder than everyone else, because I think that's the only way for me to really, I won't say be the world best, but at least to have a footing in something. So I think that's basically my experience of first few years of being a software engineer at a startup. Before after about a few years, then I start thinking about, hey, are there better opportunities out there? But that's kind of about 3 years in, right? After that, when I start thinking about there are other bigger companies that I wanted to get some experience in, because I think that's maybe a little bit of conversation for a later day. But if I were kind of summarize, right, like first few years of my experience as a software engineer, number one was figuring out if software engineering is a field that I want to continue staying in, and what was my future in there. Do I want to continue being a software engineer? Do I want to be a tester? Do I want to be a manager? Do I want to be a product manager? And I think my takeaway from that, looking back right now, is it doesn't matter too much, because you don't know what you don't know. Basically what that means is you don't want to be prematurely optimizing your career, thinking that you want to be a product manager, so therefore you should start planning and heading towards that direction from day one. What I think would be really useful was having the option to explore a lot of different things, to do a wide range of things, from front end on the UI, to back end, to client, right? So iOS, Android, and maybe trying out machine learning, trying out a little bit of like data science. Optimize yourself or optimize your experiences so that you can get a taste of all these different things before you finally pick one or two maybe different areas and then really dive deep into it. At least for me, I felt what was not really useful was for me to narrow myself down into a specific expert too early in the career. For example, picking or labeling myself as a backend engineer, right? I didn't feel that was really useful for me, because I didn't really know at the time if I wanted to be just full-time backend engineer. I wanted to try different things and see, for example, myself today, I think of myself as more of a fixer rather than a backend engineer, right? I jump into code, I can figure things out, I can understand any parts of the code base and then get things happen quickly. So that's my experience being a software engineer. I don't know if this is useful to you, but hopefully if you know someone who is considering being a software engineer or heading into like the field as a software engineer, maybe you can share with them this experience. And I would love to hear from your perspective. What were some learnings you had as an early career software engineer, and what tips you have for them? All right, that's day 3. I'll see you next time. Bye.